Welcome to another edition of the Lean Newsroom. This week we decided we're going to focus on Ferguson, or hashtag Ferguson, and the challenges it poses for legacy news organizations as they dig into the issue with such a moving target, and it's so hard to land in this. And I just think what we've seen in this, we've seen some examples of outstanding coverage, wouldn't you say, Brown?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, great examples of journalists really using social media. And I mean, also examples, I think, of just regular folks using social media to get their voices heard and to organize, and obviously that's also a resource for journalists to be tapping. So I think it's really been incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll highlight one of the people who has become sort of one of the voices on the street and actually has become one of the key sources of information has been Antonio French, who's a St. Louis alderman who has just been out there every night, out there till the wee hours of the morning, just tweeting and retweeting all kinds of information about that. What are, from your point of view, Brown, when you are dealing with, especially when you think about your social journalism programs, one of the things you think about is how do you use this information as a journalist? Because he definitely has a strong point of view and has a perspective on this. And how do you use this in a journalistic, what are some of the challenges for a news organization saying, okay, it's obvious this guy has some traction, he's on the ground. Look, he's up to 121,000 followers on Twitter, which is insane.
Well, yeah.
And how do you, what are some of the challenges that a news organization has to face in trying to deal with this new reality of somebody like this becoming one of the main, almost a journalistic voice?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think news organizations today have to identify more Antonio French's, before something like this happens, so that they can be, in some ways contributing to the larger landscape of coverage in the community. I think there's just a lot of opportunities now to get greater expertise and perspectives that we often in traditional media used to miss. So, I mean, I think it's just a tremendous opportunity, but ideally it wouldn't be, journalists have no idea who this guy even is or barely know who he is really, until this happens. I mean, ideally these are the kinds of people that, you know who they are. They're among the people that help you to understand your community better. And then in a situation like this where there's a lot changing, and you need live coverage, I mean, obviously his tweets would be a great resource to pull from, in making a storify or creating a narrative or whatever you maybe are doing. So
Right.
I think it's a great opportunity.
Well, and if you look at what's, like, I mean, just in his feed from today, here I'll zoom in on this, you can see CNN's picking up on him and talking to him, and major news outlets are realizing that he's this voice that they need to talk with. But I think going towards that, and hey, look, MSNBC, and they're talking about it. I think they have to be careful that they aren't just putting the voices of the advocates for one point of view, that they are making sure to cover the entire story as well. And making sure that they have all those perspectives. And I haven't really seen, I've seen journalists have been pretty good about not trying to be even-handed about this and realizing and keeping that in mind that, yes, you had a shooting that involved a police officer shooting an unarmed black male, which is a very volatile situation, but let's look at the nuance of this story. I think I wanted to highlight the work of Wesley Lowery for the Washington Post. I think he has done some amazing work through this too, being on the ground.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, it's always going to be important to have multiple perspectives. But, I mean, I also think I mean, I also think just searching for kind of a false balance. I guess I'm just generally in favor more of transparency than I am of, always trying to have a certain amount of balance. I mean, I like that journalists have kind of been able to give more kind of raw, on the ground perspectives, using Twitter of what they're actually observing and what they're actually seeing and what's happening, rather than kind of that he said, she said story that, I
Right.
mean, I'm not saying it's not important to get all the perspectives, but, it's just so much better what we see here than seeing just like, I don't know, the cops said this and then the protester said this, as though
Right.
there's absolutely no way for the journalist to have any, idea which one might be right. I mean, because there are some verifiable facts on the ground that, aren't really a matter of perspective, but are more like, well, this is what actually happened.
Well, and that's again why I wanted to highlight what Lowry was doing, because when he got arrested by the police, that's when he became part of the story almost.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not almost. He was the story, and so and instead of backing away from it, he writes a first-person piece about that experience, and talks about it. So, and I think that's been something that's been really important and different about this story. When you look at how crazy this story has been on Twitter, even more so than Trayvon Martin, it's because of that. It's because it has this nuance of, it's not just the racial component, it's income inequality, it's First Amendment rights, it's do I have the right to protest, it's questioning the police response and using tear gas and this kind of stuff and what is excessive. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
I think there's a number of, I was going to call that up. The Pew Research Center had a great analysis of that. Where was that? Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
I should have had that ready to go.
That's all good.
But please, Twitter.
Well, and it's interesting too. Like some people have said, well, how much are journalists becoming the story rather than reporting the story? And, I think there's that's a legitimate question to ask. But, I think that as soon as you start arresting reporters in this country, you're raising some pretty serious free speech issues. So that's another advantage to some of these social media technologies that are a little bit more raw. I mean, we're getting kind of that live perspective, and we're able to see what's really happening on the ground before it's been all kind of filtered through all the layers of editing and whatnot. So, that's an interesting thing about this too, definitely.
That was something I wanted to ask you. Do you think that in a breaking news story like this, just like with the Arab Spring, that it's important to view the journalist, especially when it comes to social media, as one of voice among many rather than the voice? Whereas in the past, that's how journalism was viewed, right? We're going to have the verified fact. We're going to be the one who tells you what's really happening out there. When I think in this environment, the reality is you have to say we're one voice among many. We can't be everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and if we're going to reflect this story accurately, then it's that concept of ambient journalism, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it's let's look at the mass and understand what's going on, and let's see what we can make sense out of and how we can verify some parts of the mass. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense? Does that?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think whether you like it or not, you are one voice among many, and there is more competition now for people's attention than there used to be. I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't still need journalists, and there's not still a really important role to play as somebody that can help verify some of this information, put it into context, answer some of the questions that people have that maybe aren't being answered. But the idea that you're somehow going to be like the voice presenting the truth on something like Ferguson, it's just absolutely ridiculous. And I just don't think if you have the illusion that you're still playing that role, you just don't really understand our current media landscape anymore, honestly.
Well, and I think that's what gets to what all of our research has been over the last couple of years, and I think that's one of the things that we keep finding is that crisis of identity, right? Whereas we, as journalists, we were the voice that people depended on to know what was true, and now they can question that, and they can look at that in the context of all the information that's available at their fingertips and decide for themselves. They can become their own journalist, and they have to actually in today's environment.
Right. Right. And I mean, that's another thing that we've been talking about transparency now for a long time, like even before, social networking got big. And I mean, I think part of that is because, all you really have as a journalist is the trust that your audience has in you. And for years, like long before even the internet, credibility was dropping. Like there were tons of studies showing that.
Right.
So the idea that people are just going to trust you because you have a brand name, that was a gradually eroding concept in America anyway. So,
Right.
I think, yeah, you have to work for it. You have to show people, here's what we've done to verify this information. Here's what we bring to the table that's maybe a little bit unique in comparison to this information that you may be being bombarded with. I think that's part of your role is just sort of showing your work, essentially. And it's just even more important in a situation like this,
Yeah.
where there's stuff going on everywhere. And you can't just take it for granted that you're, like, going to be the voice people trust.
Right. Well, and one of the other examples I wanted to highlight, I think what the Post-Dispatch has been doing they've just been doing stellar work in terms of covering the major story of their community. And I wanted to highlight David Carson has done some really good work on the ground. And I think they've just provided when the story first broke, he was the one I started following because he was out there and he just had it really shows the power of the photograph in these stories that is one difference. There are these just iconic images that have popped out. That's you look at that kind of photo is just amazing.
Yeah.
And then I think when I saw this photo, this has become the image, I think, for a lot of people. And it took me a while to realize that he's holding a bag of chips. In addition to throwing the tear gas back. But
Right.
there's just so much that's contained in that photo. And
that reminds me, one other thing that I thought was amazing was, I was watching on Twitter, and some people were actually saying, well, this is just the liberal media that's filtering all of this for you, and these protesters are all very violent and blah blah blah. And then I saw a bunch of people coming back and saying, look, dude, I was watching the live stream. Like, I was literally watching the scene live, unfiltered. So I'm not relying on like a media filter at all. I'm making these judgments based on what I saw. Now, not that even a live stream, it depends where the camera's pointed, so obviously you may not see everything, but that was really, that really got me, because I was like, that really is amazing. Like, you come back with the old, oh, it's just liberal bias charge, and it's like, well, guess what? It's not, because I watched it for myself, and this is what I took from it, and there was no editing, to the video whatsoever. So, that's pretty incredible.
And I think that's really the power of Twitter, and that's something else I wanted to note. Let's put up her post and give her some props here. Is if you look at her post, Zena, there it is. I think this was it. There, what happens to Ferguson affects Ferguson. If you haven't read this post, I would highly recommend, not you, Brown, but the people who are watching us, I would recommend reading this post. It's a very important post about algorithmic filtering, and how you don't see the story on Facebook because of EdgeRank, but on Twitter the whole fire hose is there. And if you go to, even now, if you go to Ferguson, like you mentioned, the transparency is there. You get the mix. So I have the news, NBC News, you got the Christian Science Monitor, you have the Nation, but then there are just Poynter, Pew Research, then there are individuals there who are talking about this issue. There's Antonio French again, and you can get the whole feed, especially when it's moving in real time. It reminded me of the Iran elections in 2009, when you couldn't get anything from traditional legacy media. You were getting it all from on the ground, and that this sort of reality comes through, in that. But
Right. Yeah, and I mean that also kind of reminds me of I think it was just last night. Glenn Greenwald wrote a piece for The Intercept. I don't know if you saw that, but he was actually talking a little bit more about the murder and beheading of the American colonel. But I mean, he makes like a really great point. When he's talking about whether or not Twitter should essentially suppress those images, which are obviously very graphic and disturbing. And, he was basically saying, do we really want to give them that kind of power? And, obviously the standard reply is, well, that's not censorship. I mean, governments censor. Twitter is a private company, it can do whatever it wants.
right.
But given the unique power that these kind of media companies have over the information and the knowledge that we see, I mean, it's like, yeah, obviously in this case, there are a lot of probably good reasons not to want to see that. But once you start giving them that power to make those decisions, there's a real slippery slope there that does raise some really interesting
Right.
kind of free expression issues. I think it's a really well done piece because he acknowledges kind of the other side while still making some really good points.
Well, and it gets into that other subtle issue of erasing history.
Yeah.
Should Google have the right to go in and erase posts that are out there in the public domain? I mean, there are some really thorny issues that come up and saying, if journalism is truly the first rough draft of history, should we be able to rewrite it and re-edit it? Because it's not like in the days of the print newspaper, you had that in the archive, you had those things, whereas in today's environment, you can delete it, you can edit the posts, and you don't necessarily have to be very transparent about it. But then there again, I think, is the strength of Twitter. As long as they don't start editing the feed,
Right.
That's the danger, is when they start suppressing things in the feed. That becomes a thorny issue. So.
Right. I mean, obviously, it's just, those issues are just really complicated, and there are things that I think you really have to think about. So.
No. The last thing I thought we would look at and related to this, and what we can do, we could post the links to some of these stories that we've mentioned on this, for our viewers, and our listeners. The last thing I wanted to highlight was the importance of Twitter as a news medium. I found that Pew study I was talking about, and what's interesting about this is this was moving as a social media conversation on Twitter well before it popped up on the main 24-hour, 24/7 news channels. And I think that's another really important point, is if you look at that, it started spiking about the same day, but that's where, if you're the type of newsroom that isn't embracing Twitter, and I don't know that there are that many newsrooms these days. Maybe some of the smaller ones are still struggling with how do we use Twitter, but I think it's really important that you look at how to embrace it, because that's where the news is happening in your community, and understanding how to use it and not just using it for distribution and promotion, using it as an information gathering tool, and really using it for that radar to get a sense of what's going on the ground. This is great. Look at this. Calm on another good night. That was sort of the theme I saw. I saw a number of people talking about that.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know.
I mean, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, it's not just about promotion, it's about reporting and also really about connecting. I mean, it's only one tool, but it's a really important one that can actually bring you closer to your audience and engage with them in a much more meaningful way, which, is really important for sustainability and building a, engaged audience. So,
hmm I think the big thing to me in looking at Ferguson, if I'm a journalistic organization, is I would want to look at how did these different news organizations utilize social media as a tool, and how did they track this volatile, moving story that really didn't stop and it still hasn't stopped, it's still moving, and how do you keep up with it and use these tools and incorporate them into your workflow? Because I think what this kind of event also highlights is, well, what kind of resistance are you running into in your newsroom when you encounter a photo on Twitter or you encounter information on Twitter? How are you reacting to that? Are you resistant
mhm.
to it, or are you looking at it as another piece of information we need to investigate? And that's something that can force you to really think about your own organization and your own processes. But
Right. Yeah, definitely.
yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Any other closing thoughts before
I
we
don't think so, Groves.
end
Actually,
yet?
I gotta let a dog in here real quick, but I'll be
Okay.
right back. But close it out here for us.
Okay, sounds good, Brown. So that's the end of another episode for the Lean Newsroom. Next week, we're going to shoot for doing it on Thursday at 3 p.m. for our regular watchers and listeners. And hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you've got something that you want to hear or have us talk about or be part of the conversation, let us know. You can put it on our Google Plus pages or comment on our YouTube videos, and we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in.